Smoke drifts across a forgotten valley in northern France, where a team of archaeologists has unearthed the rusted bones of a warplane, its insignia still visible beneath layers of mud and time. Inside the cockpit, a single photograph survives. A young crew smiling before a mission that never returned. The discovery sparks questions no record can answer. Who were they? What did they see in those final moments? And what secrets still lie buried beneath the fields that once burned? This is not just the story of a battle. It's the story of everything that came after. Chapter 1. Before the Storm. In the years before the Second World War, Europe exhaled with the kind of fragile calm that only comes before a collapse. The scars of the Great War still mark the cities. Walls pockmarked by bullets, fields littered with unmarked graves, men walking with canes far too young to need them. Yet the world tried to move on. Radios played dance music in Paris cafes. Children in London watched Zeppelins drift overhead, their shapes fading into the grey sky. Across oceans and borders, nations rebuilt, believing, perhaps hoping, that the worst had already passed. But beneath that calm, something darker was moving. Germany, humiliated and hungry after Versailles, was rebuilding in secret. In the small towns of Bavaria, factories once producing farm tools began stamping metal for aircraft frames. In Berlin, a former corporal with piercing eyes and rehearsed fury was learning to command the airwaves as easily as the crowds. Adolf Hitler promised revival, strength, unity. His voice, broadcast through millions of radios, spoke of destiny. Many listened and believed. In Britain, the air was thick with debate. Some wanted peace at any cost. Others whispered that the peace itself was a lie. Prime Minister Chamberlain carried his umbrella and his optimism to meetings that history would later call naive. He returned from Munich waving a piece of paper, declaring peace for our time. The crowd cheered, weary from memories of trenches and gas masks. But behind him, Winston Churchill muttered words few wanted to hear, that Britain had been given a choice between war and dishonor, and it had chosen dishonor. Meanwhile, across Europe, life continued as if history could be negotiated. In Warsaw, students filled cafes, scribbling poems about independence. In Prague, scientists worked late into the night, unaware that their laboratories would soon belong to someone else. Farmers in the French countryside tended vineyards that had seen centuries of war and still produced wine each harvest. Hope lived in ordinary routines, the clatter of dishes, the hum of trains, the smell of rain on stone streets. But the machinery of conflict was already turning. In Moscow, Stalin's purges silenced those who questioned his rule, while the Red Army grew in size and secrecy. In Tokyo, generals plotted expansion under the rising sun. Across the Atlantic, America watched and waited, still recovering from depression, its people reluctant to die for another continent's quarrel. The skies over Europe began to change. Pilots in leather helmets trained in tight formations. Shipyards worked through the night, sparks flying like fireworks over the docks. On the airwaves, coded messages replaced music. Somewhere in the distance, a door was closing, the one that led back to peace. Those who lived through those final pre-war years often remembered the light. How bright the mornings seemed, how normal everything felt, but history would remember the shadows gathering behind that light. The border crossings, the secret treaties, the speeches that promised greatness but sowed hatred instead. The world was drifting towards something vast and unstoppable. And as the summer of 1939 approached, every capital in Europe could feel it. The tension in the air, the unspoken certainty that something was coming. It wasn't just rumor or politics anymore. It was the quiet before thunder. The world held its breath and waited. Chapter 2. The Descent into War. September 1st, 1939. Just before dawn, the sky over Poland flickered with the first light of German flares. Soldiers who had been half asleep in their trenches awoke to the rumble of engines, hundreds of them, rolling across the border. Moments later came the sound that would define a generation, the scream of Stuka dive bombers tearing through the morning air. Within hours, radio stations went silent, telegraph lines were cut, and the war Europe had hoped to avoid became impossible to deny. In Berlin, Hitler's generals called it Blitzkrieg, lightning war. It was fast, precise, overwhelming. Armored divisions punched through defenses before most officers could even issue orders. Civilians fled along the same roads the army needed to advance. clogging the routes with carts, bicycles, and broken cars. German aircraft strafed anything that moved. Towns burned, and the sky turned black with smoke and fear. Poland fought back fiercely, but the enemy was everywhere at once. Within weeks, the red and white flag was replaced by the swastika. In London, the declaration of war came by radio. The voice of Prime Minister Chamberlain trembled as he announced that Britain was once again at war with Germany. Across the city, people stopped what they were doing. In churches, pubs, train stations. No one cheered. There was no triumph, only silence, and the slow realization that the world was changing again. Gas masks were distributed. Air raid shelters were built. The old men who had fought in the trenches stared into the distance, knowing what was coming. France mobilized, but its leaders hesitated. They believed the Maginot Line would protect them, a wall of steel and concrete stretching across the frontier. But modern war did not respect walls. In Paris cafes, the talk was still of patience, of diplomacy, of holding the line. No one wanted to imagine German tanks rolling past the defenses and into their streets. Yet the reports from the east told a different story. Entire divisions shattered in days, cities turned to rubble. In Moscow, Stalin watched and waited. A secret pact signed with Hitler divided Poland in two, giving the Soviet Union space to expand without interference. For now, both dictators were satisfied. The rest of the world, stunned by the speed of destruction, stood in disbelief. America, still clinging to neutrality, sent words instead of weapons. President Roosevelt's voice on the radio was calm, measured, but his words carried warning. "This nation will remain a neutral nation," he said, "but I cannot ask that every American remain neutral in thought." As the months passed, the war spread like fire on dry grass. Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, all fell in quick succession. Refugees streamed across borders, carrying what little they could in their arms. Europe was collapsing under the weight of its own fear. And then, in May 1940, Hitler turned west. France fell in 6 weeks. The world watched in horror as German troops marched beneath the Arc de Triomphe. The swastika flew over Paris, and the dream of European peace was gone. But in Britain, something else was stirring. Churchill had replaced Chamberlain, his voice defiant, roughened by years of warning unheeded. "We shall fight on the beaches," he declared. "We shall never surrender." The words echoed through bomb shelters and barracks, carried by wireless sets to every corner of the island. They were more than words. They were defiance, a promise that Britain would not go quietly into history's dark pages. And yet fear was everywhere. The Luftwaffe began its nightly raids. Sirens wailed over London, Coventry, Liverpool. Families huddled underground as bombs rained from the sky. The air reeked of dust and cordite. Above ground, firefighters battled flames that seemed to consume entire neighborhoods. Still, each morning, buses ran, milk was delivered, newspapers printed. A strange rhythm of survival took hold. Ordinary people became heroes simply by enduring. Across the seas, Japan moved deeper into China, testing its empire's limits. Italy, sensing opportunity, joined Hitler's cause. The Axis powers were complete, their ambitions stretching from Europe to the Pacific. The Allies, scattered and wounded, began to gather strength from desperation. New leaders emerged, new alliances formed, war industries roared to life. The world's economies turned from depression to total mobilization. Diaries from the time tell the same story. Fear mixed with resolve. A Polish nurse wrote, "We work until our hands no longer feel, and yet we cannot stop. If we stop, we die." A British airman, before a mission over France, scrawled a line in his notebook, "I do not fly for glory. I fly so my children might never need to." Their words survive where so many of their voices did not. By the end of 1940, the lines were drawn. Half the world was under dictatorship. The other half fought for its survival. Bombers crossed borders more easily than diplomats ever had. The maps were redrawn in blood and fire, and as another bitter winter fell over Europe, no one could yet imagine how long the road ahead would be, or how much it would cost. Chapter 3: The Fire Over Europe. The summer of 1944 began with a silence so heavy it almost hummed. Along the English coast, hundreds of thousands of soldiers waited, men from every corner of the Allied world. Americans, Britons, Canadians, Poles, Norwegians, Australians. They waited for a signal that would change the war. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. For months, they had trained in secrecy, memorized beaches by their code names: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword, and prayed that when the time came, the sea would carry them safely ashore. In the early hours of June 6th, the sky cracked open with the sound of engines. Over 11,000 aircraft filled the night: bombers, gliders, paratrooper transports. Below, the English Channel churned with an armada unseen in human history. The air was cold, thick with diesel fumes and fear. Some men prayed softly. Others stared into the dark horizon, their faces pale beneath the flickering glow of cigarettes. When the first ships reached the French coast, the night erupted into chaos. At 6:30 a.m., the ramps dropped. Gunfire shattered the morning calm. Men leapt into the water, boots heavy, rifles held high, only to sink under the weight of their gear. The sea turned red. Sand sprayed into the air as shells exploded around them. Omaha Beach, the bloodiest of them all, became a slaughterhouse. Commanders shouted orders no one could hear. The wounded cried for medics who never reached them. Waves pulled bodies back out to sea, only to deliver them again moments later. Still, they pressed on. From the cliffs, German machine gunners raked the shoreline. They had been ordered to hold at all costs. For hours it seemed impossible. Every advance repelled, every squad pinned down. And then, through smoke and chaos, small groups of soldiers began to crawl forward. Engineers cleared mines with bare hands. Rangers scaled sheer rock under fire. By noon they had breached the defences. By nightfall, the beaches belonged to the Allies. It was not triumph. It was exhaustion, raw, trembling survival. Over 4,000 Allied soldiers lay dead by the end of the first day. But the line had been broken, and through that breach poured hope. Behind the beaches came tanks, supplies, ambulances, and a tide of determination that would not stop until Hitler's empire was undone. The battle for France raged for months. Hedgerows became fortresses. Each field, each village was a fight of its own. The German army, though retreating, was far from beaten. Civilians hid in cellars as artillery thundered overhead. French resistance fighters guided Allied units through backroads and forests, sabotaging convoys, cutting communication lines. In towns like Saint-Lô and Caen, entire neighborhoods were reduced to ash. The liberation of Europe came one shattered street at a time. In the east, the Red Army surged forward, exacting its revenge on German soil. The names of battles, Kursk, Stalingrad, Leningrad, had already become symbols of unimaginable endurance. Now Soviet soldiers pushed toward Berlin, driving a broken enemy before them. For them, the war was personal. Every ruined village, every grave, every winter endured had led to this. The two fronts, west and east, were closing in like jaws. By early 1945, Germany was collapsing. The once mighty Wehrmacht was running on fumes. Hitler hid in his bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin, ranting to shadows and refusing surrender. The city above him was burning, its skyline nothing but black smoke and falling stone. Allied bombers pounded it day and night, the sky glowing orange even at midnight. For civilians, there was no safe place left to hide. Mothers carried children through the rubble. Old men filled sandbags that no longer mattered. On April 30th, Hitler was dead. A pistol, a cyanide capsule, and silence. Within a week, the war in Europe was over. But peace did not come easily. Soldiers walked through concentration camps and saw what had been hidden from the world. The emaciated survivors, the piles of shoes, the ovens still warm. The smell of death hung over the liberated camps, over towns that had turned their faces away. The soldiers stared in disbelief, in horror, and in shame that humanity could do this to itself. For the men who fought, victory felt hollow. They had survived, yes, but the cost was beyond measure. Letters home were filled not with pride, but with questions. What did it all mean? One infantryman wrote. How do you go home after seeing what men can do to each other? The answer would take a lifetime to find. Yet in that moment, amid the ruins, the smoke, and the silence after the guns, something else was born. The hope that the world might learn that perhaps this time history would not repeat itself. The war had ended, but the story of what it left behind was only beginning. Chapter 4: The Price of Peace. When the guns finally fell silent, Europe was a continent of ghosts. Cities once alive with laughter and music lay in ruins. Berlin, Warsaw, Tokyo, Dresden. Their names became synonyms for devastation. Smoke still rose from the rubble months after the fighting ended. Streets were lined with shattered glass and twisted metal. Children played among the ruins because there was nowhere else to go. And everywhere the same question echoed. After all of this, what comes next? For millions, survival was a daily act of defiance. Entire families searched for food in bombed-out buildings, tearing open abandoned ration tins, trading cigarettes for bread. Refugees, Germans fleeing the Soviets, Poles returning from camps, Jews searching for anyone left, moved in endless columns along the roads. Some had been gone for years, emerging from forests and prisons to find their homes occupied by strangers. There were no maps for what came after a world war, just ruins, hunger, and memories that refused to fade. In London, people celebrated victory but grieved quietly. The Blitz had left scars that no medal could heal. Burnt-out houses stood beside those still standing, like missing teeth in a weary smile. Every street had its absent faces, sons, husbands, brothers who never came back. The victory parades were grand, but when the music stopped, silence fell heavy again. The city that had survived everything now had to learn how to live again. In Germany, the reckoning began. The Nuremberg trials exposed horrors too vast for comprehension. The world watched grainy footage of camps liberated only months earlier, skeletal survivors, piles of corpses, the faces of those who had obeyed terrible orders. For the first time, the word genocide entered human language. In the courtroom, the accused stood in silence as evidence played across screens behind them. One witness, his voice trembling, said simply, "I am not here to accuse, I am here to remember." And that, perhaps, became the truest sentence spoken after the war. Meanwhile, the victors found themselves uneasy allies. The Soviet Union occupied half of Europe, while the United States and Britain held the other. The battle against fascism had ended, but the mistrust between East and West had already begun. Barbed wire and ideology soon divided the continent again. Berlin, already broken, became the front line of a new, invisible conflict. One fought not with bullets, but with fear. Yet amid the ruins, life found a way forward. Markets reopened. Schools gathered children under bomb-damaged roofs. Musicians returned to their instruments, playing in concert halls missing half their walls. The first post-war weddings were small, often held in uniform, sometimes without rings. But they happened. Proof that love could still exist among the ashes. A British nurse wrote to her sister, "We dance in buildings with no roofs. It rains on us, but we dance anyway." Across the Atlantic, the United States emerged into a strange prosperity. Its cities untouched, its industries booming. America became both rescuer and rival. The Marshall Plan promised to rebuild Europe, but it also marked the beginning of a new kind of influence. Economic, political, cultural. Coca-Cola and jazz crossed oceans as easily as reconstruction funds. Hope was being rebuilt, one blueprint at a time. In Japan, the surrender had come only after unimaginable destruction. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were more than names. They were warnings written in shadow and fire. Survivors, the hibakusha, spoke softly of skies that burned white and winds that carried silence. Their stories reshaped how the world understood power itself. For the first time, humanity had created a weapon capable of ending its own existence. The war had not just changed borders, it had changed what it meant to be human. Back in Europe, memorials rose slowly. Stone markers, bronze plaques, simple crosses. Some graves were named, most were not. Villages rebuilt from rubble, their walls still embedded with fragments of the old war. Every spring, flowers grew between the cracks in the pavement, stubborn and bright against grey stone. Life, it seemed, refused to surrender. Yet for those who had lived through it, peace was complicated. Veterans returned home to faces that had aged without them. Some found work, others found only silence. Many carried nightmares they could not name. The war followed them into sleep, into family dinners, into the quiet moments when the world was still. A generation had been asked to save civilization, and now they had to learn how to live within it again. And so the rebuilding began, not just of buildings, but of trust, of decency, of belief in something better. The war had taught the world how fragile those things could be. In its aftermath, humanity faced its reflection, scarred but still standing. The peace that followed was not the end of conflict, it was the beginning of remembering. Chapter 5: Shadows of the Modern World. Decades have passed since the last shots of World War II echoed across Europe, yet the war never truly ended. Its ghosts linger, not in trenches or ruins anymore, but in memory, in politics, in the quiet corners of the modern world. Every museum exhibit, every fading photograph, every silence at a memorial service carries the weight of those 6 terrible years. For the survivors, history never became history. It remained personal. The world that rose from the ashes was new but uneasy. The Cold War began, before the old war's graves had even grown grass. Former allies became rivals. America and the Soviet Union stood face to face, their weapons more powerful than anything imagined in 1945. The race for supremacy, nuclear, technological, ideological, defined the rest of the century. Yet underneath it all lay the same fear, that humanity could repeat its own destruction. Across Europe, cities rebuilt into modern skylines, their scars hidden beneath concrete and glass. Yet beneath those streets still lay the bones of old battles, unexploded bombs, buried bunkers, the occasional discovery that reminded people just how thin the distance between past and present really was. Children born decades later would stumble upon rusted helmets in forest soil, or find family names carved into memorials they had never noticed before. History, no matter how much time passed, refused to stay buried. The legacy of the war reached beyond borders. Nations rebuilt identities shaped by loss and resilience. Germany became a democracy defined by its responsibility to remember. Japan turned inward, reshaping itself through pacifism and progress. Britain, weary but proud, carried the memory of endurance like a quiet medal. And America, victorious but changed, learned the cost of global power. Each nation carried its own version of the same lesson, that strength without empathy leads only to ashes. The survivors grew old. Their stories, once told in hushed tones, became lessons for their grandchildren. A former pilot spoke of fear, not glory. A camp survivor described hope in the smallest acts. A piece of bread shared, a song whispered through walls. These testimonies became the moral architecture of the modern world. Without them, the numbers, 6 million, 50 million, 100 million, would be just statistics. But through their voices, the war remained human. By the late 20th century, the front lines had shifted from battlefields to memory. New wars erupted elsewhere: Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, each haunted by lessons learned and unlearned. The old alliances evolved into NATO and the European Union, institutions born from a desperate vow, never again. But even that vow wavered with time. The human tendency to forget, to look away when history grows uncomfortable, became its own kind of danger. And yet, the war's shadow gave the world something else: a blueprint for resilience. Out of the wreckage came the United Nations, international law, humanitarian aid, and the first universal declarations of human rights. For all its failures and hypocrisies, humanity had at least tried to codify decency. The idea that ordinary people, civilians, refugees, the powerless, mattered was not born in peace, but in the memory of war. As the last veterans pass away, the responsibility to remember shifts to those who never lived it. That's the challenge of the modern era. When there are no more living witnesses, will memory still have power? Or will it fade into documentaries, dates, and textbooks, stripped of the faces and voices that once gave it meaning? The answer lies in how we choose to listen. In recent years, archaeologists and historians have continued to uncover remnants of the war. Bunkers sealed for decades, letters buried beneath floorboards, reels of film showing moments once censored. Each discovery adds another thread to a tapestry still unfinished. Every artifact, no matter how small, reminds us that the past is not gone. It waits, patiently, beneath our feet. When we walk through Europe's quiet fields, we tread on history. Beneath the grass lie the fragments of shells, the outlines of trenches, the unmarked graves of those who never made it home. And in cities, beneath traffic and neon lights, the echoes of air raid sirens and footsteps in the dark still seem to linger if you listen closely enough. The war ended, but its story keeps breathing through the cracks of the present. The Second World War was not just a conflict of nations. It was a test of what humanity could survive. And though it scarred the earth, it also proved something extraordinary: that compassion can outlast cruelty, that even after total ruin, people can rebuild, forgive, and remember. As time moves on, memory becomes our only defense against repetition. History is not just what happened, it's what we allow ourselves to forget. And so, the silence after the war remains not an ending, but a warning, because the past is never truly gone. It simply waits for us to look back.